April 26, 1945. Linz, Austria, western bank of the Danube. Night falls with a steel-cold bite. The sky, shrouded in smoke and low clouds, reflects at intervals the distant glare of the bombardments. On the bank, the river looks like a living beast, dark, dense, endless. The current drags along trunks, scraps of wood, and the twisted shadows of the war's last days. The men of the 130th Engineer Battalion of the United States Army stand motionless before the water. Their uniforms are soaked, their faces smudged with mud and fatigue. For weeks they have pushed forward behind Patton's Third Army, building roads, repairing bridges, and silently dismantling mines. But this time is different. This river is not just another obstacle on a map, it is the Danube, the final border before reaching Czechoslovakia. Around them, the truck engines keep running. Headlights are shrouded with tarps to keep their glow from betraying them to the German artillery, still firing from the opposite shore. Each explosion rolls with a metallic echo over the water. The air smells of smoke, diesel, and rain. Colonel Walter Jensen, commander of the battalion, walks slowly among his men. In his hand, he carries a mud-stained folder. Orders just arrived from higher command. He reads them softly without lifting his eyes. The Third Army must cross before dawn. Silence. Only the murmur of the river can be heard. Jensen raises his head and adds, in a dry voice, "We have 48 hours to build the bridge." No one answers. The men trade weary looks. They know what it means: 2 days to raise a structure capable of bearing tanks, trucks, and entire columns of infantry. 2 days to defy a river that at this time of year can swallow whole boats. One of the sergeants, a tall man with a face scored by soot, breaks the silence. "That's not a river, it's a border." Jensen looks at him without expression. "Then we'll have to move the border." The wind blows from the east, bringing the sour smell of fires and the promise of more rain. Jensen heads back toward the improvised command post, a tent propped up with planks and sandbags. Inside, maps are pinned down with stones so the wind won't take them. On paper, the Danube looks simple: a blue line, a crossing point, a deadline. In reality, it is a mass of enraged water, with a current so strong it can carry off a pontoon in seconds. The engineers begin unloading the trucks: metal sections of Bailey bridges, steel tubes, gasoline drums, ropes, inflatable pontoons, and tools. Every piece is heavy, every movement clumsy in the muck. Some men kneel on the bank to sound the depth, others set up the first concealed lights under camouflage tarps. From the far side of the river come German voices and a brief flash. A tracer round crosses the air and dies over the water. No one moves. Jensen watches the point where the bullet disappeared. He knows that, at any moment, the enemy can concentrate artillery fire if they discover what the men are doing. The field watch reads 21:47 hours. The countdown begins. Lieutenant Robert Hall, head of Company A, approaches the colonel. "What do we do if the artillery starts firing?" Jensen doesn't look at him. "We finish the bridge." In the distance, the sky flickers with an orange glow. The echo of artillery blends with the constant roar of the river. The men begin to work without speaking, barely communicating by gesture. On the water, the first pontoon barges move slowly, moored with thick ropes. A young engineer, hands numb with cold, watches the river and murmurs, "I never thought the end of the world would look like water." His partner answers without taking his eyes off the Danube. "It's not the end of the world. It's the beginning of the next." Tools ring in the dark. Rivets fall to the ground with a metallic tinkle. The first pieces lock into place. The clock starts to run. Spring of 1945. Europe is a field of ruins. The Third Reich is collapsing, but it is not surrendering. German cities are smoking skeletons, armies dissolve into columns of prisoners and refugees, and strategic maps become obsolete by the day. Yet, on the margins of the Danube, on the border between Germany and Austria, the war still breathes. George S. Patton's Third Army advances from Bavaria toward the southeast, chasing the last German forces trying to escape into Czechoslovakia and the mountains. In their path, towns seem suspended between the end and fear. Some fly improvised white flags, others burn after brief, desperate fights. Patton does not stop. His objective is clear: take Linz, secure the bridges over the Danube, and open a route toward Bohemia's industrial heart. The river, however, is a different enemy. It cannot be bombed or outflanked. The Danube, fed by the Alpine thaw, is now a liquid wall, nearly half a kilometer wide, with a current that carries whole trees and the debris of the Reich's collapse. The stone and steel bridges that once spanned Linz were demolished by the Luftwaffe before withdrawing. What remains are ruins, twisted pillars, sunken cables, and charred structures. Allied maps show the Danube as a thick blue line. The engineers call it Europe's wound. On the other side, the remnants of German units, infantry, anti-aircraft artillery, even armed students, still resist. They fire from the woods, block the crossings, blow up roads. The war is lost for them, but their orders are clear. Delay the enemy as long as possible. To the east, the Red Army has already crossed the river at several points in Hungary and Romania. To the Soviets, the Americans will not make it in time. Reports intercepted by Soviet intelligence claim the Western advance will stop at the Danube and that Patton's forces will take weeks to throw a bridge across. In Moscow offices, generals remark calmly, "The Ibamba River will decide the border." The Germans share that hope. From the hills north of Linz, their observers watch the American columns halt at the riverbank. The American barges look fragile, the trucks bogged down in mud, the men study the channel with binoculars. Everything suggests the advance has stalled, but the Americans do not plan to wait. In Third Army headquarters, orders circulate with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. The crossing must be carried out in under 2 days. The enemy must be pursued without rest, and the river overcome without delay. Patton himself, impatient, unleashes his usual blend of demand and dare. "I don't care how wide the river is," he says. "We'll cross it or die trying." The infantry divisions stop at the edge of the Danube, but they do not rest. The engineers unload the first trucks, inspect the banks, and search for anchor points. Meanwhile, American artillery fires toward the far bank to keep the Germans' heads down. Within hours, the landscape changes. Where there was only water and silence, tools, improvised cranes, pontoons, and steel girders begin to appear. Every hammer blow sounds like a declaration. The Soviet High Command, far away, believes the Danube will stop the Americans for weeks. But Patton's Third Army was never known for stopping. The Danube was not a river, it was a border, a living line, wide and murky, that cut the continent in two like a wound still open. In Linz, its channel exceeded 400 meters in width, with a cold, powerful current that dragged branches, planks, barrels, and even the remains of destroyed bridges. Its average depth reached 9 meters, and its speed more than 2.5 meters per second. A man who fell into the water would not have time even to cry out before being pulled beneath the surface. The fixed bridges that had crossed the city no longer existed. The Luftwaffe, in retreat, had demolished them methodically. First the anchors, then the steel spans, and finally the concrete bases. The explosions had left a landscape of ruins along the banks, twisted beams, blackened rubble, and the hollow echo of metal when the waves struck the remains. Without a secure crossing, the Third Army's armored divisions were trapped on the western bank. Sherman tanks and M3 transports waited in silent rows, sinking their tracks into the mud, powerless before the river's immensity. Every hour lost allowed the German forces on the far side to strengthen their positions or destroy the routes into Czechoslovakia. For the engineers, the scene was an impossible equation: a swelling river, unstable ground, and a still active enemy line. The soil, saturated by April rain, dissolved under the weight of the trucks. The inflatable pontoons warped under the pressure of the current. Each attempt at anchoring had to be redone 2 or 3 times before it held. The younger officers looked at the dark waters and understood why Soviet command had assumed the crossing would be slow. There were no makeshift bridges and no friendly banks. The Danube offered no weak points. Its strength was uniform, inhuman. Colonel Jensen gathered his men beside the bank and sketched a plan with a stick in the mud. A floating Bailey bridge, supported by pontoons and barges, assembled directly on the water. The structure would have to span nearly 400 meters and be raised while the enemy watched from the opposite shore. There was no alternative. The memory of Remagen, the Rhine crossing barely a month before, was still fresh in everyone's mind. Then, the engineers had worked on a captured bridge under fire, but with a solid foothold. The Danube offered none of that. There would be no ruins to build upon, no pillars to bear the load, only water. The river would be both obstacle and foundation. One foreman, seeing the channel, said quietly, "At Remagen at least we could put our feet on something firm," Jensen replied without taking his eyes off the water. "Here we don't need land, only courage." The enemy on the other side kept quiet. They were not firing yet, but everyone knew they were watching. German snipers had good visibility from the Urfar hills, and the gunners could sweep the bank with a single burst if they spotted the assembly point. The Danube, in its apparent calm, was a trap. A wrong step could sink not just a barge, but the entire operation. The current battered the banks with a dull, constant roar, reminding the engineers that the river had its own pulse, its own time, and they had to beat it before dawn. The order remained the same. The bridge had to be ready in 48 hours. The clock moved on. Colonel Walter Jensen spread the map over the mud-splattered hood of a jeep and smoothed it with his palm. The order was written in black ink, brief and final. The bridge must be operational in 48 hours. No excuses. Signed, George S. Patton. There was no margin for doubt. The Third Army had to cross the Danube before dawn on April 28th. If they failed, the enemy would regroup in Czechoslovakia, and the war, already in its death throes, could drag on for weeks. Patton demanded results, not explanations. Jensen lifted his gaze toward the river and knew what lay before him was not just an order, but a sentence. Either they crossed, or they were trapped. His resources were as impressive as they were insufficient for the task. 2 companies of the 130th Combat Engineer Battalion, about 300 men in all, 60 vehicles, including cargo trucks, DUKW amphibious transports, jeeps and field cranes, 24 motorized barges, 200 Bailey pontoons, each of heavy steel, designed to be assembled like pieces of a gigantic erector set, and a handful of portable welding rigs, plus improvised tools, hammers, saws, cables, generators. That was all that separated the United States Army from the eastern bank of the Danube. Protection was minimal. An infantry battalion covered the perimeter with machine guns and mortars, but the German line remained alive across the river. From the hills, the flashes of isolated shots could be seen. Enemy observers watched through binoculars from the shells of ruined buildings. They knew that the moment they detected activity, they would open fire. Jensen gathered his officers around the map. Mud streaked their faces, fatigue carved their eye sockets, but all listened intently. "The objective," Jensen said, pointing with his finger, "is to assemble a Bailey bridge of 381 meters. It must bear the weight of Sherman tanks and artillery trucks. This is not a provisional crossing. We need a complete, stable, secure road." One of the lieutenants, a young man with the look of someone who no longer believes in miracles, spoke up. "Colonel, with this current, it cannot be done in 48 hours. Jensen looked at him for a moment, his voice level. "You're right, Lieutenant. It cannot be done, but we'll do it anyway." Silence settled for a few seconds. No one protested again. The engineers began to lay out the plan. They would build 3 parallel lines of pontoons to form a floating base, a central line for heavy traffic, and 2 lateral lines for reinforcement. The anchors would be fixed to the riverbed with steel cables, and the Bailey spans would be assembled directly atop the floats, bolting and welding the sections under the light of flares and shrouded lamps. The main challenge was not the design, but the time. The clock was running, and every minute counted. To meet the deadline, they would have to work without rest, 12-hour shifts, without interruption, under fire, in conditions of extreme exhaustion. Jensen knew Patton's order allowed no failure. He had heard him say it more than once. An army that stops is a defeated army. So, instead of excuses, he asked for volunteers for the first assembly wave. One of the battalion's veterans, Sergeant Hank Dobbs, looked at the river and then at the colonel. "When do we start?" 5 minutes ago, Jensen answered. The first wave of trucks rolled out. Wheels squealed in the muck as they unloaded steel sections and inflatable pontoons. The men began to organize the pieces by number and size, each following a pattern memorized from so many previous campaigns. but none had worked a river like this. At dusk, orders rang out between the wind and the distant thunder of artillery. Generators roared, torch flames lit the hunched figures of the engineers, and the sound of hammers on metal set the cadence of the effort. In Wehrmacht reports, the Danube had been described as impassable for heavy equipment during spring. Jensen read that line before folding the paper into his pocket. Then, he said, it will be spring only for them. Rain began to fall hard. The clock marked the first hour of the eve, 48. Night fell moonless, thick as the river's own water. Intermittent rain turned the ground into a mire where men sank to their ankles. Mud mixed with spilled fuel from the trucks and with the sweat that ran beneath the slickers. No one spoke more than necessary. The order was to work in darkness, no headlights, no flashlights, no flames. A single visible spark could betray them to the German observers across the way. The engineers worked by touch, by memory, and by voices arising above the river's noise. Hammers struck metal in a muffled rhythm, covered with blankets to deaden the sound. Each blow was a small risk. Each tightened bolt, one step toward the impossible goal. The Danube growled with a deep, steady sound. The pontoons, hauled in by DUKW amphibious vehicles, barely skimmed the surface, tied off with ropes that thrummed under tension. The current dragged branches, planks, and whole tree trunks that slammed into the freshly assembled structures. Many pontoons broke loose before reaching the assembly point. Others sank without warning, swallowed by the river. The men worked without rest, soaked through, faces caked with mud and breath visible in the cold air. Their hands, numb, could barely grip the tools. Every few minutes a voice would rise, lost in the dark. "Pull that line, hold it!" A treacherous eddy tore one pontoon from its mooring. A soldier, without thinking, leapt into the water with a rope tied around his torso. For a few seconds, his silhouette showed on the surface, lit by lightning. Then, he vanished. No one saw him again. Colonel Jensen recorded the loss in a sodden notebook without stopping the work. There was no time for ceremony. Around him, the mud and water became a single mass that swallowed boots, tools, and hopes. German artillery sent a couple of scattered bursts from the far side, but missed. Perhaps the Germans believed the Americans were only fixing roads or setting up camps. Perhaps they were waiting for dawn to confirm what was happening. Lieutenant Hall approached the colonel, jacket soaked, voice hoarse. "How much time do we have?" Jensen looked at his wristwatch, caked with mud. 47 hours and 58 minutes. Hall nodded without replying and returned to his post. That phrase, half joke, half sentence, echoed among the men as they labored. It was a reminder and a dare. At midnight, progress was minimal. Barely the first dozen pontoons had been secured. The wind picked up, driving the water harder against the bank. Steel cables tightened until they shrieked. Some engineers reinforced them with improvised hooks made from tank chains. Others, on their knees, tried to line up the cold edges of the Bailey sections in the dark, feeling along with their hands. The rain returned with more force, beating the river until it seemed to vibrate. In the distance, isolated shots could be heard. The Germans were testing the range. Bullets hit the water with brief flashes that vanished at once. The men kept working. The darkness was their protection and their punishment. The clock kept running, relentless, turning seconds into meters of steel. At 2 a.m, Jensen walked along the bank, watching the progress. He could barely make out the hunched silhouettes of engineers over the structure, moving like shadows. The rain slanted down, and the river seemed more alive than ever. In his mind, the colonel counted each span, each meter left, each hour lost. The Danube did not sleep, and neither did they. Dawn brought a gray, cold glimmer, just enough to make out the silhouettes on the eastern bank. The river's silence broke with a first sharp crack. A shell landed far off, throwing up a column of water that splashed the pontoons. Then came a second, closer, and a third, bursting right in front of the assembly line. The Germans had discovered the operation. The salvos continued, rhythmic, like a metronome of destruction. Each impact hurled a rain of water and mud over the men crouched on the metal. The engineers did not scatter. They barely covered their heads with their hands, waited for the next lull between shots, and went back to bolting, fitting, welding. The order was to continue without stopping. On the western bank, Sherman tanks answered with covering fire. Their guns swung toward the firing points and began launching high-explosive rounds. From the flanks, MA-7 Priest self-propelled guns added their roar to the steel chorus. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of hot metal. The engineers worked in the middle of a contained hell, where every step forward was a victory over fear. The structure grew span by span. Bailey girders locked one after another atop floats inflated by hand, held by cables tightened to their limits. The river shoved with violence, trying to rip away the freshly fixed pieces. Metal groaned, bolts bent, hands bled on wet steel. But no one stopped. A lateral span broke free and began drifting downstream. 3 men threw themselves on it, grabbed it with hooks, and hauled it back, panting, caked in slime. In the confusion, a cable snapped, its metallic crack mingling with shouted warnings. A girder fell into the water with a dull thud and vanished beneath the current. Colonel Jensen watched from a small rise. His coat was soaked, his face blackened by smoke. Each explosion made him flinch, but he did not take his eyes off the work. Beside him, a radio operator reported progress at 20-minute intervals. Jensen barely answered. A fresh salvo fell closer. A pontoon split in two, and the water swallowed it. An engineer, by reflex, dropped to his knees and began securing the gap with the few parts left on hand. Jensen shouted from the bank, "Leave that span! Move to the next!" The man lifted his head and nodded without stopping his hands. Each section of the bridge became a brief story of effort, fear, and stubbornness. The soldiers spoke. Little. Orders were gestures, glances, blows on metal. The noise was deafening. The Danube's roar, the crossfire, the moan of steel forced past its limits. A young engineer, fingers bloodied, allowed himself a moment to look at the water. "This river is alive," he murmured. His partner, tightening a wrench without pause, replied, "Yes, and it doesn't want us to cross." The bridge pushed forward meter by meter, floating atop the Danube's fury. From afar, the structure looked like a line of shadows moving over the water. Up close, it was a symphony of strikes, sparks, and held breath. The river kept roaring, dark, deafening, as if trying to devour what those men were raising. But they kept working, defying the current, the artillery, and the clock. That bridge did more than join two banks. It joined human obstinacy against the logic of nature and war. Dawn came like a gray wound across the sky. The rain had become a constant drizzle, fine and cold, light enough to wet everything without offering relief. The men of the 130th had gone more than 30 hours without sleep. Their faces were masks of mud and fatigue, their uniforms a blend of fabric, blood, and dried fuel. The river's roar had become a continuous sound, almost internal, a pulse that seemed to come from their own bodies. Throughout the night, they had managed to assemble 220 meters of floating structure. From the western bank, the bridge stretched over the Danube like an irregular steel spine. But more than 150 meters still remained to reach the far shore. Time, already their enemy, was turning into an implacable judge. Colonel Jensen walked among the men, stopping only to give short orders. His voice was hoarse but firm. "Check the anchors, reinforce the floats. No one stops, no one." The Germans on the far side were beginning to retreat into Linz, but they still maintained artillery positions on the eastern heights. Every so often, a shell crashed into the water, throwing up a tower of spray that fell like rain upon the men. They no longer flinched. They had learned to tell by sound when an explosion would fall near and when they could keep working. By mid-morning, as a crew fixed a new span, tragedy struck again. One of the central sections, weakened by the current, gave under tension. The steel cables whipped free, and the bridge partially collapsed. The sound of metal breaking was a dry roar, followed by the shouts of men trying to hold it. In seconds, part of the structure disappeared beneath the water, taking tools, plates, and 2 inflated pontoons. "Hold it!" Jensen shouted from the bank. Ropes screeched. Men, kneeling on the metal, threw hooks into the water to snag the pieces drifting away. The river devoured them, one after another. Some plunged in with harnesses on, trying to recover lost sections. The current hammered them with fury, as if the Danube were guarding its border with invisible claws. After 20 minutes of struggle, they managed to rescue part of the structure and drag it to shore. The damage was serious but not total. Jensen ordered the anchors reinforced with chains from Sherman tanks and improvised tensioners. The men worked in silence, knowing any delay could mean failure. The colonel, drenched, climbed onto one of the sections and surveyed the stretch of bridge still to be built. The Danube kept roaring, indifferent. With each minute, the water rose a little higher, fed by rain falling upstream. The engineers knew that if the level climbed too much, the whole structure could break free and twist around itself. But there was no time for calculations or rest. Over the radio, Jensen's voice repeated the same order again and again. No one stops. No one. On the margins, men ate cold rations with one hand while welding with the other. Some had fingers so numb they could not feel their tools. Others simply kept moving, driven by a mixture of routine and pride. The afternoon darkened, the sky a colorless mirror. On the horizon, American guns kept firing, covering the noise of explosions with an even greater noise. In that chaos, the engineers advanced meter by meter, fighting the river, fatigue, and the inevitability of time. At 3 in the afternoon, Jensen checked his watch. 36 hours elapsed, 12 ahead. The bridge was more than halfway, and the Danube, for the first time, seemed to yield. The afternoon of April 27th arrived wrapped in a strange silence. It was not calm, but the prelude to something everyone feared. The sky had turned a dirty gray, and the rain, which at first fell like a fine mist, became a steady downpour. The Danube, swollen by upstream rains, began to rise with new force. The surface widened, the currents quickened, and the pontoons began to pitch violently beneath the structure. The engineers watched the steel cables supporting the bridge tighten until they vibrated. Some gave off a high, keening sound, as if the metal were crying out. The calculations were clear. If the water level rose 10 centimeters more, the strain on the anchors would exceed the breaking point. If that happened, the entire bridge, 280 meters of steel, sweat, and sacrifice, would come free and be swept downstream like a toy. Colonel Walter Jensen reviewed the numbers with his chief engineer, a thin man named Harris, who could barely hold a pencil in his trembling fingers. "If it rises another handspan, it's over," Harris said without lifting his eyes from the notepad. Jensen listened in silence, then looked at the river and answered softly, "Then it will not stop rising. We'll make it yield." The decision was immediate. Jensen ordered barges anchored diagonally upstream, forming a kind of floating shield to deflect part of the river's flow. It was a desperate idea. The barges were not designed for this, and if even one came loose, it could smash into the bridge with force enough to destroy it. But it was the only option. The men began to improvise. They hauled out Sherman tank chains, scraps of steel, even parts of damaged tracks, using them as improvised anchors. Each link weighed more than 30 kilos, and groups of 4 dragged them, half submerged in mud. The work was blind, exhausting, dangerous. Barges lined up in diagonal, held by crossed cables, and the river pounded them like a constant fist. One mistake, one miscalculation, one rope that gave way, and everything would be lost. As the rain fell, the Danube rose another centimeter, then another. The men knew the river might win, but they could not stop. On the banks, engines roared, pumping air into the pontoons and keeping them barely afloat. The sound of water striking steel was deafening. By mid-afternoon, as Jensen coordinated the maneuvers from the bank, a messenger arrived spattered with mud and with a radio on his shoulder. He was breathing hard, soaked and exhausted. "Colonel," he said, "message from command. The 5th Infantry Division is a day's march away." Jensen stared at him. "A day?" "Yes, sir. If the bridge isn't ready when they arrive, the advance will halt." The news hit the bank like another weight. The men looked at one another. They knew what it meant. If the division stopped, the whole line would fracture. The enemy would have time to reorganize, and what they had built would be for nothing. Jensen clenched his teeth and looked at the river once more. "Tell them," he ordered, "the bridge will be ready when they arrive, not before, not after." Night drew near, and the Danube kept rising. The anchored barges held with a deep, almost human sound as the water smashed against their hulls. Each vibration traveled through the bridge's entire structure like an irregular heartbeat. The men kept working, soaked, unable to see the end. Some swore the river was alive, that it breathed, that it was watching them. Perhaps it was. The Danube, with its overflowing current, seemed to want to test whether the men who defied it would hold as long as the steel they had brought. Jensen, caked with mud, put a wet cigarette to his lips and held it there, unlit. "There are no miracles, only work," he murmured, and he went on giving orders. The race against the clock had truly begun. The last night came without stars. The sky was a black canvas slashed by the intermittent glare of flares. The rain had ceased, but the air stayed damp, charged with electricity and smoke. The river roared louder than ever, as if protesting what was about to happen. Portable generators hummed by the bank, throwing a yellowish light over men smeared with mud and grease. Sparks from torches lit tired faces and bleeding hands. The air smelled of burned metal, rubber, and cold water. No one spoke. The sound of tools filled the darkness. The engineers of the 130th moved like a single organism. Each knew what he had to do. Orders were no longer needed. The watch read 0450. Only minutes remained to meet the impossible deadline. The structure stretched almost complete, joining two worlds with a floating line of steel. The last span, a piece 15 meters long, was the most dangerous. It had to be set in place precisely in the center, where the current struck hardest. The men worked leaning out over the water, boots clogged with mud, hands slick. Each bolt had to align to the millimeter. One mistake, and the whole bridge could collapse. Colonel Jensen watched in silence from the bank. His face was smeared with soot, his eyes were red with fatigue. Around him, radios crackled with distorted voices, engines roared, and flares flashed over the Danube. When the final bolt was secured, Jensen gave a single order: "Lower the ramp." The final section locked in with a metallic groan. The whole structure thrummed like a taut instrument, but it held. Waves rippled through the pontoons, which rocked and then settled back into place. At 0520 on April 28, 1945, Colonel Jensen climbed into his Willys Jeep. The engine coughed twice and caught. With a brief gesture, he signaled his driver. Behind him, a small squad of sappers escorted him on foot, weapons shouldered, alert to the creak of metal beneath their boots. The vehicle rolled slowly onto the newly completed bridge. Every meter was a test. The river kept pressing, dark and endless. The steel shivered under the Jeep's weight. Midway across, Jensen turned to his chief engineer, Harris, who followed on foot. "How long did we take?" Harris checked his watch and answered without raising his voice. 47 hours, 35 minutes. Jensen nodded. "Patton will be disappointed. We had 25 to spare." The humor was dry, forced, but enough to draw a smile from the men. When the Jeep reached the opposite bank, everyone held their breath. Jensen stepped down, set foot on firm ground, and looked back. Behind him, a Sherman tank crept forward, its tracks drumming on the metal. The pontoons dipped for a moment under its weight, then stabilized. The bridge held. The engineers burst into muffled cheers. Some embraced, others simply let themselves drop into the mud, exhausted. The line of steel stretched across the Danube, firm, defiant, shining under the first gray light of dawn. They had beaten the river. They had beaten time. Dawn on April 30th, 1945, brought an unusual silence over Linz. The artillery fire had gone quiet. The last German detachments had surrendered or scattered, and the roar of American engines now dominated the riverbanks. The bridge was still there, floating over the turbid water, a steel line suspended between war and victory. For 2 days, the engineers of the 130th had slept only a few hours. Even so, they stayed close to the structure, checking anchors, replacing rivets, and watching the guy cables that vibrated under the constant weight of the convoys. From dawn onward, columns of Sherman tanks, GMC trucks, and troop transports crossed the bridge without pause, heading north. The steel arched and creaked, but held. The Danube, which for centuries had been a border between kingdoms, armies, and civilizations, had yielded to the will of men who did not believe in the impossible. 3 days later, Soviet vanguards arrived from the east. Their ZIS trucks and T-34 armored vehicles halted on the bank. The Russian soldiers, exhausted after weeks of fighting, stood looking at the bridge with a mix of surprise and respect. No one had expected to find it standing. A Soviet officer, his coat dust-stained and cap at a tilt, stepped down from his vehicle and studied the structure from the river's edge. The girders gleamed in the sun, caked with dried mud, while the river kept pounding the pontoons with relentless force. The officer drew a breath and said softly, almost to himself, "Our engineers would have taken a week." Beside him, an American engineer, his face smeared with grease and his hands still black with soot, tightened a nut at the base of the bridge. He did not look up. He answered calmly, without stopping his work. "We didn't have a week." The Soviet smiled, unoffended. He looked at the man and then the bridge, and understood that the structure was not just a technical feat, it was a message, a silent reminder of what American logistics meant: speed, decision, and an unyielding will not to stop. The water kept slamming into the pontoons, but the bridge stood fast. Traffic rolled on above it, tanks, jeeps, ambulances, ammunition trucks, all moving without pause. The floating steel line joined two armies who, though allied, knew the post-war world would be very different. The Danube, a symbol of frontier for centuries, had been crossed in 2 days. And with it, an invisible line had been crossed as well, the moment when engineering and human will overcame the very idea of a border. The Soviets left soon after, without touching the structure. The bridge remained in use for weeks, bearing the passage of thousands of tons of steel and men. No one called it a miracle. No one called it heroism. It was, simply, a job done. But in the eyes of the men who built it, in their hands cracked by labor and their boots still sunk in the Danube's mud, there was something deeper. The quiet certainty that they had beaten the river, time, and fate. The bridge over the Danube was not only a technical feat or a tactical success, it was a silent declaration, an act of engineering turned symbol. There, over Austria's gray waters, the United States Army proved that modern war was no longer won by tanks and guns alone, but by logistics, calculation, and speed. For centuries, the Danube had marked borders. It was a natural line that defined empires and checked invasions. Romans, Ottomans, Austrians, and Germans had tried to master it, but all had respected it as a barrier. In April of 1945, for the first time, that border was defeated not with fire, but with precision and steel assembled against the clock. The Soviets understood at once. When their officers looked upon the floating bridge at Linz, they grasped that American industrial power did not lie only in the number of tanks produced or the might of their bombers. It lay in their capacity to build where others saw the impossible, to turn the chaos of war into a machine of continual advance. The Americans did not only know how to destroy, they knew how to connect. Every tightened bolt, every plate welded in the Danube's mud was a practical statement of logistical supremacy. Unlike European armies accustomed to measuring war in kilometers of territory, American engineers measured it in hours of work. Where others counted losses, they counted bridges. When Colonel Jensen submitted his final report, he wrote only one sentence. The crossing was completed as planned. No mention of the rain, enemy fire, or human losses, only the fulfillment of the objective. For him and his men, the feat was not heroism, it was craft. But history read it differently. The bridge at Linz became an example, studied in military academies, political offices, and factories around the world. It was the tangible demonstration that power no longer depended on conquering, but on moving faster than the adversary. In Moscow, Red Army reports described the crossing with a mixture of respect and alarm. The Americans have made steel into a tool of time, one said, and they were right. The 20th century belonged to those who mastered that time, to those who could think, manufacture, transport, and assemble faster than the enemy could react. In Linz, that truth took shape as a line of steel floating on a river that for centuries had seemed untamable. Every bolt tightened on the Danube was a silent message to the world. The future would not belong to those who destroyed more, but to those who built faster. In less than 48 hours, the men of the 130th Combat Engineer Battalion changed the course of a campaign, and with it, the tempo of a war nearing its end. What began as an impossible order became a bridge that joined two banks, two armies, and two different ways of understanding power. The bridge at Linz remained in service only a few weeks. When the war ended, it was dismantled piece by piece, crated up, and taken off the Danube as if it had never existed. The pontoons returned to warehouses, the girders to depots, and the men to their homes. The river returned to its natural course, indifferent, erasing the traces of steel and human effort. But the story did not disappear with it. In military engineering manuals, in Third Army tactical reports, and in anecdotes passed through generations of sappers, the crossing of the Danube was etched as one of the war's greatest demonstrations of coordination, speed, and courage. The Soviets remembered it too. In the years that followed, General Staff reports often mentioned that crossing is an example of American logistical power. Russian officers cited it with quiet respect. The Americans not only know how to fight, they know how to build under fire. And they were right. That bridge, born of mud, fatigue, and steel, was more than a temporary structure. It represented an idea that human ingenuity can prevail even when the enemy is not another army, but time itself. When Colonel Jensen left Linz weeks later, he paid one last visit to the bank. The river flowed calmly, with no trace of the work that had defied its force. He lit a cigarette, watched the current for a few seconds, and murmured to himself, "Nothing that's worthwhile lasts forever. But while it lasts, it changes the world." The Danube kept to its course, but its border had been conquered. While others saw an impossible river, they saw a road, and they crossed it.